All right, our speaker today is my old friend Joe Bessler. I asked Joe how long he'd been around, and he's been around quite a while. I knew him when he was a young whippersnapper, just starting out teaching at Phillips. And gosh, he's been there for nearly 30 years. And now he's an old whippersnapper. and the word that's come to my mind every time I see you is grizzled. I think it's this thing. It's very sophisticated and knowledgeable. Professorial is a great word. But he always teaches us something, and we always go around and say, what the heck did he say? So here he is.
Thanks, Mike, I think. It's funny, I always think of myself as that whippersnapper. You know, and it's like, I wasn't supposed to be the Ancient of Days, which is now rather my experience. So we have a ceremony every year at Phillips where those who, are acknowledged who've served 5 years and those who've served 10 years, 15 years, in those 5-year increments. And so this last Wednesday, Nancy was going through, and we've hired any number of people just within the last fiscal year. And then there's quite a group at 5 years and a couple at 10 and somebody at 15 and nobody at 20 and nobody at 25. There I am at 30. So anyway, it is my pleasure to be with you this morning. And it's always a joy to me. Larry, thank you for the prayer. And so this is a program that we don't necessarily need to get to the end of it to have some fun. So I'm not wanting to just kind of rush through something, but I am wanting us to think about something. And that is, how is it that Jesus, who is Jewish, right, comes to be interpreted over 3 centuries, 4 centuries, not simply in Jewish terms, but also in more Greek philosophical terms. How does that happen? Why does it happen? So that's what we're trying to look at. So I better carry this around. So we'll... And then the importance of that, because what this transformation ends up shaping really the way most of us in this room grew up religiously. Most of us grew up with some variation of St. Augustine's interpretation of Scripture and Platonic tradition. And so, this is something, again, we could spend really weeks on, semester on, and so you'll be happy when I'm finished. But what time do we have? Yes. You have trouble? Is that better? Thank you. You wouldn't be the first to say that. Let's say, okay. Great. So it's better? Okay. So, of course, Jesus doesn't become Plato, nor does he become Play-Doh, that stuff that we play with, right? But anyway, but rather, when do apologists, those who are defending and standing up for Jesus as the Christ, right? When does that become? When does their lens, that while it's affirming Christ, is also shaped by this philosophical worldview, right? Which is in fact a wider worldview than what Jesus grew up with in Nazareth. There's a lot of things going on here. So when they, in order to be persuasive to their audiences and to enhance their influence with those audiences, they proclaim him, they defend him, they testify to him in the language and imagery. Imagery is very important here as well, of the Platonic worldview. Okay, so now we're saying, okay, so that's really the question that in some ways we're getting at. What's very important here is note these dates. Plato was born in 429 BCE, before the Common Era, and dies 347 BCE. This is 400 to 500 years before the birth of Jesus. Right? Plato is very influential. Right? His main student, who disagrees with him on many things, as many dissertations do with their professors, they disagree, is Aristotle. So we're looking, one also down the road could look at Aristotle, but again, you have these important thinkers. And so before we get to this, just realize that part of what's going on is that this philosophical thought of Plato, which we're going to go through, right, is it's in the water culturally, right? So when Paul talks about spirit and flesh, is that simply drawing on a Jewish tradition? Is it also drawing on a Platonic tradition? It's kind of in the water. Does that mean Paul's a Platonist? No, it's in the cultural water. These are terms, these are images, these are ideas that help people frame their arguments. So, here is a question that Plato is asking in one of his most famous dialogues called The Republic, right? And in that he's asking about, well, what would be the form of an ideal city-state that would not fall prey to the vicissitudes, the challenges of time and decay? Because he looks around him and all he sees are city-states that, yes, they may be born in glory for a moment and then boom, they fall, right? Or over time, one sees an erosion in culture. And right? So what he's asking here is, what might, right? He's thinking, what might a city-state be? How might it be governed in order to maintain that greatness once achieved? And is it even possible? So here he brings a kind of philosopher's inquiry into, he wants his thought to have realistic impact, right? So notice that this is at one level a political question, right? He's interested in how the politics of this might work. It's a political question that Plato roots within human nature. This will be very interesting, right? So it's not just mere politics or something. This is politics, but it's rooted in the nature of human beings. We're going to see it's rooted in rationality, right? It's in this combination of spirit and flesh, right? So, and then within nature itself and within reality, capital R. So here is somebody whose thorough examination, right? This is not Plato is not up to a mere political analysis. It's going to be political, but it's going to be rooted in human nature. And that view of human nature itself is going to be rooted in reality and how you understand reality. Okay, so what is the problem that Plato sees in this, right? The problem is time. Why do things, right, become great and then fall and then collapse? There is this movement of time. We are born, we grow up, we die. We grow old and die. There is this structure, and part of him wants to resist that. He's like, does it have to be that way? This movement of birth and then growth and then dying and death. And then notice the other, if time is a problem, that means change is a problem. Because what happens over time? Change, right? And so, Plato realizes that we're caught up as human beings within time and within change, right? You might already begin to think how Christian theology is going to begin to play with those images and those assumptions. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Things are born and things die. An insight similar to that of Ecclesiastes in the Hebrew Bible. All is change. Is nothing sure? Is nothing stable? Is there no way one can resist or defeat death and the death of culture? These are heavy questions that he's asking, that he's putting on the table. But what if? Here's the what if behind the Republic. What if change is not the depth of reality? Interesting. Height, depth. What if, in this sense, depth is the fullness? What if change is not the fullness of reality, but only the surface, only apparent? What if change is only apparent? And what's really real, what's genuinely real, what's true, is that which is unchanging. Ooh, he begins to play that card here. Now, among us, good friends, we can say, or we can ask, isn't it in some ways, we don't have to answer this question, in some ways, isn't it odd that one would go for an understanding of truth to what doesn't change? That the criterion of truth is that which doesn't change. At some level, we need to recognize there's something odd about that. It almost seems to be a kind of denial. What do you think we're doing here, Plato? You think, but this is going to be an exchange that goes back and forth over centuries into our own time. Right? It's that suspicion and hope which underlies the experiment of the Republic. An unchanging truth? Question mark. If so, how would you know it? What could you trust? Can you trust the senses? No way. The senses, even sight, which is the most noble because it goes the farthest, right? Even that changes. Right? Think of eyewitness testimony with a good defense lawyer. Sliced and diced. There is this sense that, will the senses get us to an unchanging truth? No way. What about the passions? Oh, that's even funnier. The passions are all about change. If anything, you're trying to constrain the passions. There's this famous image that Plato uses of a charioteer trying to constrain these horses. And these horses, one of them represents the passions, and the other represents reason. And it's like this charioteer is getting torn apart. So the passions aren't going to give you that. What about reason? Reason. No, I mean, we change our minds all the time, don't we? But maybe, what if education can teach reason? What if reason might be teachable? What's his example here? Number. 1 plus 1 is 2. This, of course, assuming base 10, right? 2 plus 1 is 3. 4 plus 1, 5. So, how long, in principle, could we do this? Exactly, forever. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because, let's see, if you say forever, that suggests infinity, doesn't it? But now let's see. I'm getting old here. What number is infinity? I'm just forgetting. Right? Infinity. We can know, Plato's doing it right here. St. Augustine will follow him, right? In his tract on free will. And he'll show a proof of God's existence. And he goes right to this number. Right. So what if reason is teachable and the infinite, we can know that the infinite exists through number, but we cannot know what the infinite is. Think about that. We don't know what number it is. More generally speaking, we don't know what the infinite is. Why? Because it's not finite. Infinite, finite. And if it's not finite, it's not in time. This is interesting. This is interesting. Right? So arithmetic here, he's using as a clue to the nature of reality itself. That is graspable by reason if reason is taught, right? Reason has to be educated. You're not born knowing 1 plus 1 is 2. Your parents, your teachers are going to sit down with you, and as you look at these marks and you say, what is this? And when you're 3 or 4 years old or 5 or 6, and they're saying, well, this is math. And it's like, what the hell? What's math? Right. Well, this is math, 1 plus 1. We start doing this, and we learn by doing. So number points to the infinite, which we cannot grasp, but also demonstrates the reliability of reason when educated. Okay. The truth of number does not change. This is what Plato is looking for. If change is the problem, he's looking for a depth of reality that doesn't change. And that's where his hope will lie. Is it certainty? No. I mean, it's certain mathematically. Is it certain that we will enact that? No, because we are finite. We are human beings. We want our country to beat your country if necessary. We want our religion to be truer than your religion as necessary. We have these desires for influence and power that also shape us. So number's conceptual, not physical or material. It is beyond sensual knowledge and beyond the passions, right? So think about Paul in a passage like in Romans, where he's saying, and he's speaking about the spirit and the flesh. Which is better? I'll ask you, the spirit or the flesh, according to Paul? The spirit. And you know something? Nobody would even bother to ask. They know that. How? It's in the cultural water. Spirit is better than flesh. In part, this is the influence of Plato over 400 to 500 years. right? And so Paul, he's not a Platonic philosopher. He's more like a rhetor in terms of rhetoric. He's a speaker. He's seeking to persuade, to bring people to Christ. But in that activity, right, he's drawing on imagery that people are familiar with. So, do you see what's being leveraged? A response to the problem of change. So if change is the problem, what is unchanging is the solution. Basic kind of thing. This happens in Christian theology when I'm working with students. I talk about, okay, here are the different moves. There's going to be an affirmation of the goodness of human beings or of the world, of creation. And then there's going to be the discussion of a problem. And in Christian theology, we call that sin. And then there's going to be the discussion of the solution to the problem, which in Christian theology we call Christology. How Jesus as the Christ responds to that problem. And over the centuries, the interpretation of how Jesus as the Christ responds to that problem, and even the nature of the problem, that can change. But this structure, this process of argument, of proposal, of understanding faith, that structure doesn't change. Right? So there's a solution to the problem, and then of course, if you believe the solution, that's important then to gathering those who are authentic and those who are not. There's a boundary created there, right? Oh, we could spend weeks on this. I love this stuff. It's like, yeah, Joe, we know. Okay, so here's the Platonic leap. What is ultimately real is like the truth of number. That's real with a capital R, right? It's ultimately conceptual. So here we have to talk about the forms. Very fun. So if what is ultimately real is that which is unchanging and infinite, right? Is this chair fully real? Looks pretty real. But we're all modern people. Is this chair really real for Plato? No. Or that chair or that chair. Now, is it nothing? Is it? No, it participates in reality. But it's not reality itself. You can have all sorts of different chairs, but they're all chairs. They all conform to the form of chairness. Right? And so that's what's really real here, these ideas. How much time do we have? Am I? Really? Okay. And do we want to have some time for conversation? Yes? Okay. So let's say, let's give us at least 10 minutes for conversation. Keenan, can you help me? Okay. So it's ultimately conceptual, the forms. And the forms are going to be what? If they're not material, they're going to be spiritual. You can see this argument beginning to layer here. So the forms, this is, right? So the idea of this world, oh, this is fascinating, as a shadow, as participation, but not fully real. This image of a shadow is profoundly important in the history of philosophy. Because as a shadow, it's not like we know. There's my shadow right there. No, wait a minute, but is it real? Well, it's real as a shadow. Is it Joe? No, Joe's here. Right? So you see this sense of a shadow is important. Because it's the way in which you can begin to say a shadow participates in reality. There's a shadow to the chair. And in fact, for Plato, you could have the ideal chairness. You could have this chair, which participates. And then you could have either a plate or an artist or a poet writing about a chair. Oh, that's lower still. For Plato. Kick those poets out of the true society because they're a bunch of liars anyway. I mean, these poets are making things up. It's fascinating. Who's in and who's out in Plato's world. So the idea of the world as shadow. So this gets us to, is it here? The platonically, yeah, here we go. The myth of the cave. We can do this in just a few minutes, but it's a very telling story, and it opens book 7 of the Republic. And he says, education, the process of education, is like the following. Imagine that there is this huge underground space, this cave, if you will, and that everyone in it is seated in a position, and they've always been there. And their hands are locked down, and their feet are locked down, and they cannot turn their heads. They can only look one way, right? From infancy till death. He said, now, what can these people see? He says, now imagine that at the back of that cave, right, there's a fire. And there are figures running back and forth behind that fire, so that what people can actually see in front of them, because they can't, is the shadow on the wall. All right? Plato's point is that most of us, conventional people as we are, we grow up in a world of shadows. We grow up being told what reality is, and we follow along, right? We grow up thinking we know that the appearances that we take to be reality are in fact not, right? It takes education to press beyond appearance to reality. It's a fairly deep thought, right? And what he's after there is to say, now imagine that figures come from above and take one of these people and drag them out of the cave. Why drag them out? Because they don't want to go. You think education is a sweet process? Heck no, it's not. It's painful. So you're getting dragged out of this cave. And then imagine this person who suddenly is in the sunlight. And what do? They're squinting and they look down. And what do they see when they look down? A shadow. Oh my God, they're not fully out of the cave even yet. So then it takes time for their eyes, for their senses, to become familiar with the light. And that light, that's the eternal. That's the spiritual. Right? Now imagine that once this person has seen the light, as it were, we use that phrase all the time, and they see what is truly true. Now imagine that they are sent back into the cave to tell all these other people about the nature of reality. What do you think happens? They all laugh and say, look at this cloud. He can't even, because once again, his, hers, theirs, they can't, they're still getting used to being underground now. Right? And so there's people who mock those who go through this process of education and seeing the eternal, because any idiot would know that this is reality moving along these walls here. Okay, so this is a fabulous story to mine. It takes just a few minutes to find it. You can find it right away on Google or whatever, just Story of the Cave. Boom, it'll come right up. So the ruler of Plato's Republic, shouldn't it be wouldn't you expect the leader of such a community has to enforce right and wrong, should be a military person? Plato says no. No. What you need is a philosopher king. Someone like Plato, I suppose. Right? But you need a philosopher king because a philosopher king will be wise. So here you see wisdom is that which pursues spirit. It pursues that which is infinite. It pursues that which is true, right? This set of arguments proves to be an invaluable resource to Christian theology as you begin to get into the 3rd and then especially the 4th centuries. And then from there on, poof, right? Okay. Platonic worldview. You got a few on this? Okay. Here's a map of reality, as it were, in shorthand. Oh. Notice what's above, that which is eternal, unchanging, spiritual, rational. There's a field of terms there that are going to be played out. You could add, by the way, gender terms here. For Plato, this is also going to be aligned with the male. Right? Surprise, surprise. Then underneath, you have the temporal world, the changing, physical, emotional, and then female is going to be here because women are more connected through childbirth, especially to time and to the ongoingness of time. And then there's a dotted line. I put a dotted line there to emphasize that it's not a strict dualism, but there's participation. You can go up and down in this. So there again is something when in Christian theology we think of spirituality as an ascent. Where does that come from? Well, maybe from the Bible, as Moses ascends the mountain for the Torah, but it's really also enforced by this language of ascending from the cave to the sunlight, of ascending from below in materiality towards wisdom. This is a journey, right? So the logic of hierarchy, interesting, becomes the logic of ascent. From the temporal to the eternal. So in the Symposium, another dialogue, beautiful dialogue, it's on the nature of beauty. Plato uses the image of a ladder to show how one moves or climbs from the love of beautiful things, like flowers, right, to more conceptual loves of proportionality. What makes something beautiful? Proportionality does. It's part of that. The laws governing beautiful things, and finally to the love of beauty itself. So there's this ladder. You know, some people are just always going to be stuck on, oh boy, there's a pretty flower. Isn't that lovely? Well, it is lovely. But then someone else might come along and say, do you notice part of what makes that beautiful is not just its color, but the way in which these petals interact? And who knows? And then beauty itself. Oh, this reminds me. The forms. Of all these forms, chairness, Plato argues that there are 3 basic forms. Beauty, truth, and goodness. And that these 3 forms resolve to one form, the good. Does anybody hear a whiff of the Trinity there? I don't know. Maybe it's just me. But there's something here that again, these eternal forms, beauty, truth, goodness, the good, right? This intellectual worldview is going to be a resource for Christian theology. Let me be very clear. It's not that Christian theology is simply adapting or adopting Platonic thought. But that Platonic thought is a resource. It's an intellectual resource for the shaping of Christian theology so that it's persuasive in this Hellenistic world. As it moves into the world, especially in the 3rd and 4th centuries, when it becomes the dominant religion of the blooming Roman Empire, the very empire that put Jesus to death. So suddenly, right, Constantine in 313 says Christianity is going to be a favored religion of the empire. 387, Theodosius is going to say Christianity is the official religion of the empire. 384, Augustine undergoes his conversion. And I think one can argue plainly enough through his works that he's aware that Christianity is now a religion of the empire. And therefore, there has to be a reason why everybody needs to be Christian. There has to be a reason why everybody has to be baptized, has to enter the true church. All of this language. And by the way, the reason for that for Augustine is going to be original sin. Original sin is going to ensure that everybody needs the salvation. The salvation what? The salvation in hullabaloo and whatever? No. Just the salvation of Christ. Right? These arguments are important because through them we see what becomes, in many ways, the assumptions on which theology and our religious beliefs are taught. From Augustine's 5th century, I mean, Luther and Calvin, they don't want to disagree with Augustine. He's an authority. Aquinas doesn't want to disagree with Augustine. He could get in hot water if he doesn't agree with Augustine at this point. They all could. So he becomes an authority. So notice this ladder of hierarchy. So hierarchy also then becomes a power structure, as we all know, right? Power of command and obedience. All right? Is there a dark side to this? Perhaps so. So here there is a longing for stability. There is a longing for fidelity where feelings don't change. There's a longing for work that won't end next week. There's a longing for a kind of peace for a nation at war, a nation that's lost, longing for friends who won't abandon us. Right? The language of commitment is also here. A language of belonging is also here. The longing that death, the ultimate change, won't be the end. That longing. Suddenly what Augustine and others are going to realize is that the Platonic worldview can help make sense of that eternal realm in a way that Jewish thought by itself doesn't. Okay. This might be a good time. How are we doing on time for some? Okay. Still 20 minutes?
15.
All right, 15. So then here in this part, how do all things Jesus become all things Plato? How and why do Christians turn to a Platonic worldview to explain, here's a key word, the significance of Jesus as Savior of the world? So, technical point, I'll be done with it in just a second. Don't want to bore you with it, but there is a difference between Jesus and Christ. Christ is not Jesus' last name, right? In this sense, rather, Christ articulates the significance of Jesus. Why is this Jesus important? So in classical theology, very much informed by a Platonic worldview, Christ is the very perfect image of God. Here you have image language, imitation language. You have language that you can hear in Plato's language of shadow and reality. But here is the perfect image of God, who enters into time from the eternal realm to save us from our sins. You begin to get a sense of how this logic plays out? Yeah, maybe, Joe, maybe, I don't know. But this is then the way in which this then happens. So the language of incarnation, the significance of this Jesus is that here is the one and only, according to the Christians here, the one and only place where the eternal and the temporal meet. Healing. Time is healed in the Christ. right? Time is opened up. We are liberated from sin, as that language will go, in the realization of the Christ. That we are then called to, well, imitate. So, this Platonic thought is in the water. It's in the water, and some New Testament resources, which we won't go through in detail here. But notice 1 Corinthians, wisdom and foolishness is a profound one. We've already run into it in the cave. The people in the cave think they're wise, but they're really foolish. And what can appear foolish can really be wise. So when we like to think that Paul invented this argument, no. This argument is in the water. And Paul uses it because he needs it, by golly. Because here's Paul trying to convince Kim here that she should follow this Jesus as the Christ, right? That she should become part of this fellowship. And Kim says, well, I'll hear you out, Paul. Tell me about this Jesus. What did he do? Well, he was a wonderful teacher. He wrought all sorts of miracles. And she says, yes, and what happened to him? Well, he was crucified by the Romans. At that point you say, see you later. Right? I mean, what sense does that make? Paul realizes, first chapter of 1 Corinthians, he knows he's up against a very difficult argument. He's got to help persuade people. What the heck happened here? That's a shadow, right? He's got to convince people that what is apparent foolishness is really wisdom. And that's how he does it. So then in Romans 8, we already talked about that, the play on flesh and spirit. In Galatians 4, there's a whole use of allegory. We don't have time to go into it. But Paul actually says, and this is an allegory. An allegory is a Greek mode of interpretation in which what happens? In which there's a surface level to the text, which anybody who can read, which is still a narrow band, anybody who can read can understand the surface of a text. But then there's deeper levels. And what do they call these levels? The first obvious level is called flesh. The second level is called soul. The third level, spirit, which is only for the wise. Those elitist, well, all right. So think of this. We're getting an interpretation of reality. We're getting guidance on how to read texts. We're getting guidance on how to live a moral life. And in John 1:18, you have, of course, this powerful image for Christian thought in the notion of the Logos. The Word become flesh. How is that going to be interpreted? Through Platonic lenses. John may not be a Platonist, but once Christians get to the 3rd and 4th century where they have real influence in shaping the culture, boy, let me tell you, they're going to interpret that text through Platonic lenses, right? In the beginning is the Word, right? And oh, by the way, then you get a language like creatio ex nihilo. Oh, creation out of nothing. Save that for another day. But that also comes from this basic logic. So notice what's at work here is what I would call the search for a wider narrative. Right? What theology and Christian theology, it doesn't stay fixated in Nazareth or in Jerusalem. The Romans destroyed Jerusalem. Nor does it stay rooted in Jewishness. The Jews are again slaughtered in 136, 137 by the Romans. Christians begin to realize at this point in the mid-second, going to the 3rd century, that their own story needs to, in some sense, evolve, and it needs to embrace a broader narrative. And what we've just been walking through are the elements of that wider narrative, that all things, right, here's the language of Christ word, the currency of divinity, of a divine man. Currency is an interesting word. I like it as an image because we like to think of divinity of Jesus as the sole divine person. But in the ancient world, especially in the Roman Empire, Caesar was also worshipped as a god. Caesar was also divine. So the language of a divine man is not itself, again, unique to Christianity. But Christians utilize it within as a currency of significance, right? How important is Jesus? Well, tell me how important your emperor is, right? Well, he's a divine man. We'll see that and raise you, right? So in the second century, you've got Justin Martyr, who's going off to be martyred. And he says, now wait a minute. He's writing to the Roman Senate and to the emperor, and he's saying, you've made this mistake before. Right? You all, your culture, killed who? Who was the famous Greek philosopher killed, forced to drink hemlock? Socrates, the founder of Greek thought, was himself killed by this imperial structure. And Justin is saying, you've done this before. And notice the language he plays with now. He says, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, they participated in the Logos. But we Christians, we worship the whole Logos. Clever, one very clever argument. We worship the one Logos who came into this world. Yes, these Greeks, they participated. We can use their arguments, therefore. Insofar as they participate in truth, we can use them. But we transcend them through our religious language, this growing worldview, this narrative, right? There's a language of the hiddenness of God. Platonic view of reality with its play of appearance and reality provides a rhetorical, coherent model of interpretation. Early Christian theology, we can talk about these folks maybe in another time. You say, oh, God, spare us that. But anyway, this could be a fun time here. And the wider narrative. So here's how this kind of develops. You begin to get over time by the 4th century. And that itself, again, is fascinating. How do you get the idea of a Trinity, for God's sake? Where does that come from? But this is part of the wider narrative. So God takes the initiative in creation of the world, in which, son of a gun, there's another hierarchy from nature to animals to human beings. What distinguishes human beings? Reason. Right? And then you go, then there's sin. There's this original goodness, and then there's sin that turns away from God, and then God, to save the world, right, reaches out in Christ. So you see how this is a narrative? Here's the narrative of the beginning, a middle. Then, this is key, this is even key politically, the notion of the church. In other words, to participate in the vision of the Christ and in the accomplishment and achievement of the Christ, one has to believe. One has to belong to the true church. So the whole argument of the true church and what constitutes the true church, is it dogma? What is it that constitutes the true church? That becomes, right, the presence of God in the world, as it were. And then this church is being guided by the Holy Spirit. So you have beginning and then you have eschatology, the end of creation. This huge narrative that is, let's be clear, being invented throughout these 3 and 4 centuries. Thinking about, okay, good. perfect time. We've already kind of done with that, so let's just, I'll take note of where we stop in case, we get together again soon. If it's too long, we'll all forget, and so we need to go through this again. Anyway, questions? Yes, Kim.
Well, thank you for this. I didn't know anything about Plato, so this, as you were talking, I was thinking of Paul, of how much, again, the water of Plato and his Jewishness
Yes.
in his writings, kind of I know you can't give me a percentage, but obviously it was what you're thinking about.
A lot of scholars, New Testament scholars in particular, would say and would remind us that Paul never converted. There was nothing yet to convert to. There's a good book that's out by some friends of mine called After Jesus, Before Christianity. And so the word Christian is itself not really used much until certainly the late 2nd but 3rd century. Why? Because there are different experiments of communities, right? The community of the way. There'll be then the people of the, so there's different ways in which they will identify themselves, and there'll be different practices. Some practices will involve sharing of the meal. Some will involve, and therefore reclining at table. Some will involve more acts of compassion. So there's an emergence that occurs again over time that begins to shape that, and then begins to shape what? Our interpretation of Paul. So Paul, for us, we grew up thinking of, well, Paul's the original Christian or one of the original Christians who then proclaims Christ to the world. Well, okay, but not really. Not quite that clear, right? Yes. Yes, Dave.
Here, Mike, let me give you a, Hank wants me to give these.
Well, and Dave's got a question too.
You say all things participate in God insofar as they are created. Could you turn that around and say God participates in all of us?
What kind of a heretic are you? No, I know. And that is really, because what you're asking is a crucial question of everything from modern to now what we might even call postmodern theology. What is it? What happens when you realize that the theology that we grew up with wasn't handed down in some perfect form? That the scriptures were themselves not dictated by God, but were human constructions. When Christian teaching is human construction, well then, what happens when we begin to realize that the Platonic worldview really isn't what we think of as the real world? Increasingly, our sense of what faith is becomes separated from our sense of what reality is. So you're asking the question of, how can we reinterpret this understanding of participation in such a way that it's not simply hierarchical or eternal temporal, but more a sense of God with us rather than a sense of God ruling us, right? And in that sense, there's a boatload of theologians who are wrestling with that and teasing that out. It'd be fun to talk about, some of those. Or we had talked about a reading group at one point, I think. But or Buzz was interested in that too.
Maybe in your answer there, I'm trying to get at the root of why there's so much discord between denominations within the church.
Question is why there are so many divisions within the denominations of the church.
Not just division, but tension.
Yeah, real tension.
Discord.
Yes, disagreement. And this is a touchy topic because we think of, let's go back to Plato. This will make it a little safer. Remember, the Republic is dealing with the level of politics as well as ethics as well as ontology, another theory of being itself, reality. So part of what we see in our time, and you could look at this in terms of going back to the Reformation. You had, Luther questioning at least aspects, certainly of the ecclesiology of the church, of the papacy and all this. You had Calvin separating here, even differing from Luther, and you began to have these then further differences, right? So some of those became based upon certain kinds of principles. Then you have the emergence of political freedom in the sense of, think of John Locke's The Separation of Church and State. It's a fascinating document. Takes a little bit of time to read it, but notice this. At the end, he doesn't sign it. Why? He could be killed for it, right? We assume this freedom, this separation of church and state. Actually, interest in the historical Jesus is rooted in this political protest around the separation of church and state, to free people to enable to address public life in a public forum apart from the church's control. In our time, what we see are more separations that are predicated upon, oh my God, I think this speaks to your point, profound sufferings and estrangements around gender, right? The equality of women, around race, the equality of all persons, what that means, a sense of loss, often on the part of workers who have lost jobs due to what seems to be foreign influences. Think of this, profound suffering involving a kind of belonging. Who belongs? Much of the Christian nationalism that I would profoundly disagree with is organized around its own logic of belonging. Who belongs, who doesn't? Boot those immigrants out. Do this, do that. And this is the way in which, notice, the Methodist Church is splitting over LGBTQ plus issues. Right? It's split before over slavery. Right? So in some ways, I want to say, don't be surprised. Because what we need is also a discourse that seeks to hold otherness together, to make sure that we're not simply at the top of the hierarchy. And that involves a kind of risk. That involves a risk of engagement. And it involves something of your point, that if God is with us, that doesn't mean that God is on our side. It typically means that God is calling us to be better than we are. Right? There's a reality of the other to be faced, to be loved. It's not just about loving the same, it's about loving the other. Okay, I think we're done. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.